Pack your bags, Emily. This house isn't yours anymore. That's what my parents told me on Christmas night, right at the dinner table, in front of the tree, the turkey, and the twinkling lights. One moment I was cutting into my slice of ham, the next my whole world was collapsing under the weight of those words. Before I continue, let me pause for just a second. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. And while you're listening, drop a quick comment with the city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these family stories travel. Now back to that night. I stared across the table, trying to process what Mom had just said. Her voice was calm, almost businesslike, while Dad nodded as if every word had been rehearsed. You've lived here rent-free long enough, Emily. It's time to grow up. Your father and I need this house for our retirement. I froze. This was the house I'd grown up in, the hallway where I'd taped my childhood drawings, the staircase I used to slide down on Christmas morning. It wasn't just a house. It was my history. And now, on Christmas night of all nights, they were erasing me from it. New Year's Day should be enough time, Dad added firmly. 1 week. That's fair? I bit back a laugh. They had no idea what I'd done for them over the past few years. They didn't know about the late nights I stayed awake juggling bills that weren't mine, the thousands I paid in hospital fees when Dad's heart gave out, or how I'd quietly made sure their Lexus passed inspection even when they thought the warranty covered it. In their eyes, I was still the failure, the single daughter in her early 30s with no husband, no children, and supposedly no direction in life. They didn't know I was the one who had kept the roof over their heads, so I set my fork down slowly, my hands steady despite the storm rising inside me. They thought they were kicking me out. They thought I'd crumble, beg, plead for mercy. But what they didn't realize was simple. This wasn't their house anymore. The room fell into silence after Dad's ultimatum. I could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace, the clinking of my brother-in-law's fork as he set it down, even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Everything slowed, like the universe was giving me a chance to decide. Would I argue? Would I cry? Or would I let them see what I'd been hiding all along? I looked at Mom. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. Dad sat tall, convincing himself he was in control. And then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, he said, "We've already contacted a realtor. The house will be back in our names soon enough. You just need to respect that." I almost smiled. Respect. That was rich. For years, they hadn't respected a word I said about my work, my choices, my life. In their minds, I was still the irresponsible daughter clinging to comfort. I pushed my chair back slightly, letting the legs scrape across the hardwood floor. The sound made everyone at the table look up. "You want me gone by New Year's?" I asked softly. "That's right," Dad said. "A week is generous." For a long moment, I didn't answer. I reached into my bag instead, my fingers brushing against the folder I'd carried with me for weeks. I hadn't planned on pulling it out tonight. This was Christmas, after all, but they had forced my hand. I placed the folder on the table, right between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce. Mom frowned. "What's that?" I flipped it open, sliding the first page across the table. The bold black letters seemed to glow under the chandelier. Property deed. Owner, Emily Carter. "Impossible," Dad muttered. He grabbed the paper with trembling hands, scanning it like his eyes could erase the truth. Mom leaned closer, her lips parting in shock. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You stopped paying the mortgage 3 years ago, right after Dad's heart attack. Do you remember what the bank told you? That foreclosure was inevitable?" Dad's face went pale. "We caught up," he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "You thought you caught up. What you didn't know was that I bought this house from the bank. I paid off the $780,000 you owed and kept it in the family name. For the past 3 years, you haven't been giving checks to the bank. You've been living here because I allowed it." That was the turning point. Mom's fork slipped from her hand and clattered onto her plate. My sister-in-law gasped. And Dad, for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. I folded my arms, letting the silence sink in. So when you tell me to pack my bags, remember this. You've been living in my house all along. The silence around the dinner table was thick enough to choke on. My parents just stared at the deed lying between the gravy boat and the cranberry sauce, as if the ink itself had betrayed them. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, sometimes with tears, sometimes with shouting, but sitting there, all I felt was calm, almost cold. Mom finally found her voice. Emily, this can't be right. We never signed anything over to you. I kept my gaze steady. You didn't have to. The bank did when you defaulted. I bought the house legally, and I've been the sole owner for 3 years. Dad's jaw tightened. That's absurd. We would have known. I leaned back in my chair, my voice low but sharp. No, Dad. You would have known if you ever asked, but you didn't. Not once in 3 years did either of you ask how the mortgage was being paid, or how the medical bills vanished, or how the property taxes kept current. You were content to believe the world just worked itself out. That stung. I could see it in their eyes. My father blinked rapidly, the way he always did when reality didn't fit his narrative. My mother pressed her napkin against her lips, like holding it there could somehow hold back the truth. My sister-in-law whispered, almost to herself, "So this is really her house?" That was the moment. The turning point. "Yes," I said clearly, so no one could miss it. "This has been my house all along. Every inch of it. And you've been here as guests." Dad pushed his chair back, his voice rising now. "You can't just kick us out, Emily. We're your parents." I stood up slowly, the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. "And you tried to kick me out, remember? On Christmas, you didn't think twice about tossing me onto the street in the middle of the holidays. Why should the rules be different for you?" The air in the dining room shifted. Mom's eyes shimmered with tears, but she still clung to her argument. "We only wanted what was best for you. Independence. A life of your own." I shook my head. "No, you wanted control. You wanted to keep believing I was the failure, the burden. It made you feel stronger. But the truth is, without me, this family would have collapsed years ago." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and undeniable. For the first time, I saw my father shrink back, his shoulders slumping under a weight he couldn't deny. My mother reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Emily, why didn't you just tell us?" I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to scream, another part wanted to cry. Instead, I answered honestly, "Because every time I tried to talk about money, or my work, or my success, you brushed me off. You didn't want to hear it. So I stayed quiet and I helped from the shadows. But tonight, you forced me into the light." No one moved, no one spoke. The Christmas tree lights flickered in the corner, casting shadows that seemed almost alive. I took a breath, steadying myself. "You told me to pack my bags. But the truth is, you're the ones who need to decide what to do next. This is my home now, and whether you stay or go depends on one thing: respect." And with that, the balance of power in our family shifted forever. The dining room felt like a battlefield after the war had ended. Plates still full, wine glasses half empty, but no one touching a thing. My words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. I could see it on their faces, denial giving way to realization hardening into fear. Dad's voice broke the silence first. "Emily, you can't really mean this. We're your parents. We raised you. You can't throw us out like strangers." For a moment, guilt pricked at me. They had raised me in their own flawed way. But then I remembered the sting of Mom's words. "Pack your bags, Emily." And the resolve returned. "You didn't think twice about doing that to me," I said quietly. "The only difference is, I'm giving you something you never offered me. Choices." That was the new turning point. Mom looked up, her eyes wide. "Choices?" "Yes," I said firmly. "You can stay here, but things change. No more treating me like the family failure. No more dismissing my work or my worth. If you want to live under this roof, you'll do it with respect. Or, you can pack your bags." The words landed like a verdict. Dad sank back in his chair, his defiance slipping away. Mom's hand shook as she reached for the deed again, as if touching it might make it disappear. "You really saved us," she whispered. "All those bills, the house payments. It was you." I nodded. "Yes. And I never asked for thanks. I only wanted honesty, but tonight showed me that pretending doesn't work anymore. If we're going to be a family, it has to be built on truth." The tears Mom had been holding back finally spilled. "We thought we were protecting you, but maybe we were protecting ourselves." From knowing how much we depended on you, her admission stunned me. For the first time that night, I saw my parents not as judges on a pedestal, but as people, flawed, scared, and suddenly very small. Dad cleared his throat. "So, what do you want from us?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I want boundaries. Real conversations. No more secrets. No more assumptions. You wanted me out because you thought I was weak. I stayed silent because I thought you wouldn't listen. Both sides were wrong. If you want to rebuild this family, it starts now." With honesty, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the furnace, the quiet crackle of the fire. Then, slowly, Mom nodded. "We'll try." Dad gave a reluctant grunt of agreement. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever expected. I pushed my chair back and stood. Good. Because after tonight, nothing goes back to the way it was. The Christmas tree glowed behind me, ornaments reflecting shards of light across the room. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small at that table. I felt free. That night, as I carried the folder upstairs, I realized the battle was no longer about who owned the house. It was about who we were as a family and whether we could rebuild from the truth instead of lies. And for the first time, I believed maybe, just maybe, we could. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't the decorations. The garland still wrapped the staircase. The stockings still hung over the fireplace. It was the air. Lighter somehow. For the first time, I could walk through the rooms without feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to do homework as a kid. The folder with the deed rested beside my mug. My parents hadn't left during the night, but the weight of what had happened was everywhere. When Mom walked in, her eyes were swollen from crying. She sat across from me without a word, her hands trembling against the porcelain cup I poured for her. Finally, she whispered, "Emily, I don't know how to fix this." That honesty caught me off guard. My mother, the woman who always had a plan, who treated life like a series of checklists, was admitting she had no control. "I don't either," I admitted, "but I know we can't go back to pretending." That's over. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the fragile moment. Dad entered, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't sit right away. He lingered by the counter like he was still deciding if he belonged here. "We'll respect your terms," he said finally. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard. "If staying here means paying rent, so be it. I don't want to feel like a burden, not anymore." That was the new turning point. For years, they had treated me as if I were the dependent one, the weak link. Now my father, the man who once prided himself on control, was asking to stay under my roof with dignity. I nodded slowly. That's all I wanted. Respect. Not charity, not control. Just respect. The days that followed weren't easy. Conversations turned into arguments, old wounds ripped open, and sometimes I wondered if exposing the truth had only broken us further. But beneath the pain, something new began to take root. Honesty. We started small. Mom confessed how afraid she had been when Dad got sick, how she ignored the bills because facing them felt like admitting defeat. Dad admitted that his pride had blinded him, that he couldn't stand the idea of his daughter being more successful than him. And me? I admitted the truth I'd never said aloud. I was terrified that if they knew how well I was doing, they would only see me as a bank account, not a daughter. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. A few weeks later, we sat down with a family therapist. At first, the sessions were brutal. Every buried resentment came roaring out. But little by little, we started to listen. We started to see each other as people instead of roles, not just mom, dad, and daughter, but flawed human beings carrying secrets and pain. 6 months later, the house had found a new rhythm. Mom and Dad paid rent, not because I demanded it, but because they insisted. "We need to contribute," Dad said. "We can't just take." For once, I believed him. My sister, who had kept mostly silent that night, came around too. She apologized for letting me carry the weight alone and started referring clients from her real estate firm to my cybersecurity company. Slowly, bridges began to rebuild. Looking back, that Christmas wasn't the night my family fell apart. It was the night we finally faced who we really were. Because the truth is, love without respect isn't love at all. And respect without honesty? That's just another kind of lie. Now, every time we gather around that same mahogany table, there's a new tradition. Before we carve the turkey or pass the potatoes, we take a moment to say one honest thing, something we're proud of, something we're afraid of, something we've never said aloud. It isn't always comfortable, but it's real, and that, more than anything, is the gift we finally learned to give each other. Looking back now, I realize that Christmas wasn't about eviction papers, property deeds, or even the argument that split the night in two. It was about something far deeper. The moment my family and I stopped living in illusions and finally started living in truth. For years, I let them believe I was weak. They let themselves believe they were strong. We all played roles that weren't real, and in the process, we hurt each other. That night, when my parents told me to pack my bags, they thought they were forcing me to grow up. What they didn't know was that I had already grown. I had been carrying them all along. The turning point wasn't just the deed on the table. It was when I chose not to throw them out in anger, but to offer them something they hadn't offered me. A choice. Respect or distance. Truth or illusion. Family or nothing. And to my surprise, they chose family. This time, on honest terms. It hasn't been perfect. We argue, we disagree, sometimes we even hurt each other still. But there's a difference now. We know the cost of silence, the danger of assumptions, and the value of saying the hard things out loud. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love without respect is fragile, but love built on truth can survive anything. So maybe that's the real gift of that Christmas, not the presents under the tree, but the honesty we finally unwrapped. And to you, listening to my story, I want to ask, what truths in your own family are waiting to be spoken? Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that set you free. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If you found a piece of yourself in it, I'd love to know. Drop a comment with your thoughts, or even just where in the world you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these family stories reach, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, about truth, resilience, and the messy, beautiful ways families change, make sure to subscribe. Not just for me, but so we can keep building this community together, one story at a time. Because at the end of the day, the stories we share are reminders. Even in the darkest nights, honesty can turn into light.